All right, you need to think about that, because in the 5 years that you're going to be rolling out the network, this change will be more and more complete. Now, because there is a tension between this 80 and that 20, there's going to be a very strong desire on the part of the carrier to manipulate the capabilities of the network to satisfy the IPTV capabilities over the user-generated 80%. And of course, we've already had this discussion about net neutrality, which is that a carrier believes that it has the right to shape IP traffic as it's being carried over this network. And of course, in Australia that hasn't happened. There's been another sort of net neutrality argument, which has got to do with tariff rates and access to the switches. And this is the current sticking point between the ACCC and Telstra, with both sides pushing back at each other. And this has caused a bit of a bind, and that bind, we've been stuck in that bind in Australia certainly since I got here in 2003. And that bind has been a problem because essentially Telstra has decided they won't move forward until they feel the economic conditions and the political conditions are right. They think that they're pretty close now. But the consumer drive to have a high-speed network to be able to satisfy their own demands for salience and their own demands for communication with each other, that didn't get put on pause. Just because you put the economics of the network on pause doesn't mean that the actual network that we're all going around with inside of our heads because we've all been influenced by interactions with the network, that hasn't stabilized. That's only grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. And so the world outside Telstra hasn't stopped advancing. In particular, with respect to technology, it has not. It is now, I believe, as of a few months ago, costing around $750 US per household to go fiber to the household. That's Verizon's costs. And that's fairly expensive, and if you did that all across Australia, multiplied by 7 million homes, you're talking about real money. But there are other technologies that are coming online right now that will reduce the costs by an order of magnitude, and when they do that, well, they're going to disrupt the innovation that's required of a broadband network. So let's go on to that. Now, all of the parties to the great broadband dispute, the government, Telstra, the Group of Nine, and the public, they all believe, they're all carrying around in their heads the very fixed belief that this network has to be built by a large organization which has to command billions of dollars in capital. It has to dig up the streets, lay the fiber, build the big data centers. And here's the thing, that model of a network is a reflection in silicon, wire, whatever, of the hierarchical forms of organization that have characterized telecoms companies in the 20th century. All right, what you're doing is you're basically taking the Telstra org chart and then you're replicating it in wire. That's what people think this network is about. But if we've learned anything from IP networks, is that they quickly replace hierarchies with adhocracies, also called netocracies. So people connect horizontally, and meritocracies form, where a group of people who are very passionate about something get together, work on it, and then move on. And it's odd because the network that we're all in has managed to transform all of our own thinking, and yet the carriers themselves have somehow been immune from that same network effect that has affected the way we all think. All right? And I worked at GTE when I was doing my X25 stuff. I have worked at a telco, and I know for a fact that telcos are the very definition of hierarchical organizations. And during the era of plain old telephone service, this made perfect sense because the telephone network was highly hierarchical. But the internal networks for all the telcos in the world have transitioned from circuit switch networks, which are hierarchical now, into packet switch networks, which are basically self-organized, just sort of chaotic. And what this means is that the form of the organization and the form of the network have fallen out of sync, and they've fallen more and more out of sync as every day passes. And I would say that this may in fact be the big reason that there's such a current disconnect between Australians and Telstra. But we're about to see a big adjustment. Because first, the data within the network was taken out of continuity and brought into packets and sent wherever it needed to go. So we saw that breakup of data into packets. But now, we're about to see the hardware do the same thing. And telephones were centralized. because they connected point to point to a central exchange, to major exchanges, and so on and so forth. Cellular networks, no, decentralized, but, well, bandwidth was highly regulated and therefore required capital investment and all these other sorts of things. They have licensed spectrum. So both of those represented significant barriers to entry to any other person coming in and starting their own telco. But there is not any need to use wires. This is the 21st century, and there isn't any need to use licensed spectrum. Now, just the 2.4 gigahertz radio band. All right, what sits on the 2.4 gigahertz radio band? Well, cordless handsets for the home sit on the 2.4 gigahertz band. Bluetooth sits on the 2.4 gigahertz band, and Wi-Fi sits on the Bluetooth gigahertz band. Now, when the FCC in America originally handed over this unlicensed spectrum for low power uses, people were screaming that it was going to be anarchy and chaos and there would be death in the streets. And as it turns out, no, in fact, there's just a multi-billion-dollar self-organizing market of providers of all sorts of communication services that emerged out of the fact that, oh, well, actually people could play nice. But this is the argument that has been used for nearly 100 years by telecoms companies and by broadcasters, is that in fact you can't all share the same bandwidth because people won't play nice. Well, it turned out that that wasn't that way. And in fact, it turned out that the 2.4 gigahertz band had a lot of really nice features that would allow you to liberate your phone from the wall, or would allow you to liberate your computer from Cat5 and RJ45. And although these devices in the 2.4 gigahertz band had some intelligence, most of their intelligence was focused on connecting you to a centralized network. But there's been a lot of advances in software lately. And the software has advanced to such a stage that these devices can now create their own networks just on their own. And these are called mesh networks. And so mesh networks basically allow all sorts of devices to collaborate as peers. There's no hierarchy. And they can talk amongst themselves, and they can figure out who's connected to who, and they can figure out how to pass data from one person to another across the network. And there's a sort of drawing of what a mesh network looks like. And the interesting thing is, a mesh network is very similar to how a peer-to-peer network works like for file sharing, where everyone handles a little bit of load, everyone knows a little bit about everyone else, and the aggregate intelligence and the aggregate capability of the mesh network is much greater than any of the parts. Mesh networks are much more resilient than hierarchical networks, because if you take a couple of nodes out of a mesh network, it's still a great mesh network. If you take a couple of nodes out of a hierarchical network, you got problems. And of course, this was always the promise of TCP/IP networks. But in order to make the networks really easy to manage and really easy to maintain and relatively low cost, we've been using static routes from probably the early 1990s. And so there's only one way through this cloud, and it leads through the centralized network to the telco. But with mesh networks, there's no controlling authority. There's no router that provides interconnection with a peer network. And most incredibly important to this discussion, they're now extremely inexpensive to